Yeah. Cool. So it seems like the majority of everyone has made it in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to kind of give some brief introductions, my name is JD Reinbott, and I am currently the volunteer coordinator here at the Coral Restoration Foundation. And today I am joined by one of my colleagues who I'll let go ahead and introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Goodsnyder. I'm one of the lead interns here at CRF.
Yeah.
And we're gonna have an awesome presentation for you guys.
Sweet. So first and foremost, thank you all for taking some time today to come and just learn a little bit more about the world of coral restoration, or as my tacky title is, dive into the world of coral restoration. This presentation primarily serves kind of as an overarching view of what's happening to our reefs down here on Florida, and then also talking a little bit more about the different interventions that we here at CRF are doing to help mitigate these issues and find a potential resource or solution to the issues that we are seeing. How we're going to go ahead and break this up is I'm going to run through this presentation with all of you, and then we should have roughly 15 or 20 minutes at the end that we can open it up to any questions that you may all have. But without further ado, we can go ahead and get started. So for the past 500 million years, coral reef ecosystems have persisted in shallow seas. They are arguably one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet and arguably one of the oldest ecosystems on our planet. What I want you to do is basically picture a beautiful tropical rainforest that we all want to go hiking through, rip that rainforest out of the ground and chuck it out into the middle of the ocean, and you basically have a coral reef. These areas are, for the lack of better words, beautiful. You can see in this image on the left of this slide, a wonderful thicket of coral that's known as Staghorn Coral. You can see the beautiful imagery behind it, and myself as a diver or someone as a snorkeler would die to go dive on this reef. And these reef ecosystems perform a wide variety of vital ecosystem services, which we'll talk a little bit more later on in this presentation. But unfortunately, our reefs today really aren't doing so good. Since the 1970s, reefs around the world have actually rapidly degraded. And in this image on the right, you can see that same coral, but it looks pretty different. It has basically shifted from a coral-dominated reef to an algal-dominated reef, or what I like to call it, a coral graveyard. Coral reefs themselves are one of the most threatened habitats on the entire planet. And more specifically, when we look at stony corals, the corals that actually build and contribute to the overall structure of the reefs themselves, these animals are some of the most at-risk organisms facing extinction today. But let's circle back and talk a little bit more about those vital ecosystem services. When we look at coral reefs on a global scale, we can see that these reefs have an estimated economic value of at least, emphasis at least, $9.9 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. I really can't wrap my head around that. And then looking outside of the monetary aspect, for us as human beings, at least 500 million people rely on coral reefs in one way or another. It could be the fish that they use to catch and feed themselves, for coastal protection from storms, and also just other forms of their generic livelihood. But you'll kind of see that there is this running theme in the beginning of this presentation, and our reefs really aren't doing so well today. On a global scale, we have actually lost roughly 50% of the world's coral reefs in the last 30 years. Now, sitting here giving this presentation, I'm only 24 years old. And the idea that in roughly my lifespan, we have lost 50% of our corals is something I really can't wrap my mind around. And looking ahead, in the next 80 years, all shallow water coral reefs could potentially become extinct. And that means if you're ever out on a boat in Florida or somewhere across the globe, you will never see these reefs. You'll only ever see them in an aquarium, online, or in some textbook. Taking it a step further, we can go ahead and zoom into us down here in the Keys and look at Florida's coral reef. Now, this reef system is the third largest barrier reef system in the world. Jeremy, what are the first two?
I'd probably say the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and the Mesoamerican Reef down in Central America.
Awesome, thank you.
My pleasure.
With this barrier reef, it is actually the only barrier reef that we have down here in the United States. There are a multitude of other different types of formations of reefs, but when looking at this again, barrier reef structure, it's the only one we have here in the US. And in terms of length, it's over 360 miles long. It goes all the way up into Miami-Dade County and stretches all the way down past Key West out to the Dry Tortugas National Park, which means it's a lot of coral. Just like we talked on that global scale, we can also see that our reef down here provides a numerous amount of vital ecosystem services for us, as well as the organisms that live in and around it. First and foremost, as we all know, as Southern Florida residents, we are infamous for hurricanes. And these reef structures are amazing at helping protect our coastal infrastructure from storm surges and flooding. Now, granted, it's not going to prevent all of that wave energy from coming up upon our shores, but when we have a healthy reef ecosystem, that coastal damage and flooding is significantly lower. In terms of the organisms, these reefs are habitat for a wide range of fish that are targeted by both recreational and commercial fisheries, which means, again, there are people coming down and generating money via tourism to go out and fish for these organisms, and again, providing livelihood and jobs for individuals who work down here full time. And then obviously talking again about that concept of tourism, for us as divers or snorkelers or boaters, people want to come down and spend their time on their reefs. And you can imagine all the money that comes from it. Before living down here in Florida, I'm from New Jersey. And if I wanted to come fly down to Florida and spend some time diving, I would have to pay my Uber driver from my home in New Jersey to the airport, pay for that ticket down from New Jersey down here to Florida, another fun Uber drive down to the Keys. I'm then paying all the money for my hotel, for my food, for my dive shop, for the other miscellaneous tourism activities that I'm going to do when I'm down here on vacation. And at the end of the day, all of that money is coming in because I want to go out and dive on these reefs. So there is a lot of money behind Florida's coral reef. But again, just like we saw on this global scale, our reef down here in coral is not doing well at all. In the last 40 years, Florida's coral reef has actually lost roughly 97% of the once dominant reef-building corals that are known as Elkhorn and Staghorn. In that second slide of this presentation, you saw that beautiful thicket of Staghorn Coral, and this image right here is showing you some Elkhorn Coral. And in case I haven't depressed you enough already with all this, scary numbers of how much our corals are dying off, we're gonna go ahead and look at Carysfort to help further exemplify this point. Now, Carysfort used to be known as the crown jewel of the Florida Keys, and people would travel far and wide to be able to come and see this amazing reef. In this image here, you can see Carysfort at its prime, which is all the way back in 1975. Jeremy, what are some of the things you can see in this image?
Lots of Elkhorn Coral that looks like it's healthy and growing and really tall up in the water column. Lots of fish life and some clear water here.
Yeah. It's totally beautiful. These corals themselves are arguably over 6 feet in height, and they have a lot of 3D space, which is often referred to by scientists as rugosity. This rugosity gives little nooks and crannies for small little fish to come in, and then you get your larger fish, and it's this beautiful, thriving ecosystem. But what we're gonna do is go ahead and jump a few years later. This is that exact same reef, and that exact same section of that reef that we saw back in 1975. All of those things that Jeremy just listed are gone. And it is again shifted from this coral reef to a coral graveyard. That Elkhorn is gone, that visibility is okay, but hey, I've seen better. And there's really no life at all. If you look in the bottom middle of this picture, yes, there is one small little wrasse, but it is probably swimming somewhere else. Now, one of the questions we often get is what's causing all of this? And we can break this into two main things, the topics of local stressors and also the overall topic of global stressors. When looking at these local stressors, we can break them down to things like direct human impact. Us as human beings aren't always the kindest to our environment. Divers will go out and not realize that their fin tips are kicking into coral reefs. Maybe someone wants to anchor because a mooring ball is gone, and they throw their anchor off the side of the boat, and it smashes into a coral that has taken hundreds upon thousands of years to grow. And you may not think, okay, that's one person or two people, but it's not just one or two people doing that. It's hundreds of people coming down here every single day. And over a period of time, that really does start to add up. We can also look at the fact that us as human beings are extremely overfishing our herbivores. And in case you couldn't tell from those previous slides, one of the biggest competitors of coral is algae. And without those herbivores, there's nothing to actually mitigate and control that algal overgrowth. Down here in the Keys, when we were developing, we didn't have a wastewater treatment facility. And the limestone rock that we are built upon is porous, which means when people went to the bathroom, you know where I'm going with this, and they flushed, all of that waste went out into the ocean, including other types of pollution as well that can cause various forms of disease and die off for our reefs. And then also human beings, when they come down here and they're tanning on their boats or they're snorkeling and they're diving, they often use a lot of sunscreen. You don't want to get burnt. But at the exact same time, some of the chemicals in those sunscreens are really bad for our reefs. And we can look at things like oxybenzone, avobenzone, and octinoxate. And then on the global scale, we have the minor issue of climate change, where we're going to break that down into overall coral bleaching and then also ocean acidification. And those are two major issues that are happening. And we here at CRF do in fact believe that climate change is anthropogenically caused. So you may be listening to me blab on and on and on about coral, and you're like, well, why should we care? Despite the fact that coral reefs only cover 0.2% of the ocean floor, they support roughly or at least 25% of marine life. Now that's pretty obvious when you look at some of the things you can see on our reefs. You have your octopus, my personal favorite animal. You have your sharks and your rays. But some of the things that don't directly live on the reef still depend on your reefs. There may be spawning grounds for small little schooling fish that will grow and thrive and eventually move out into the open ocean that a larger whale may feed on, which means if our reefs die off and those smaller little fish don't have anywhere to spawn, there's not going to be new organisms created, and that whale is going to go hungry, which means it's going to swim somewhere else to a different reef or to a different area and have changes in its migratory patterns and migratory routes, or it's not going to find anything, and that species is going to die off as well. So with losing these reefs, we're not just losing our corals, we're not just losing the organisms that live on the reef directly, we have the potential to see a huge ecosystem collapse across multiple different locations within our ocean. But also we're humans, so we care a lot about how this is going to impact us. This is a beautiful image that was created by the Nature Conservancy that goes ahead and compares and contrasts a healthy reef versus a degraded reef. In the top of this image, you can see that that reef is thriving. There is all of that 3D structure, that rugosity again, which means you have small little fish, which brings in your sharks, which brings in your larger animals, you know, your turtles and your rays and your dolphins, which means people are like, ooh, that's awesome. I want to go diving there. Again, coming back to the topic of tourism and generating stuff for the economy. Those corals are also helping to dissipate that wave energy, which means you have the creation of a safe harbor. So other recreational activities like that individual on the sailboat are having a really good time. With a healthy reef, you also see significantly larger yields of fish that are hopefully being taken from the ocean sustainably. And we also see that with a healthy reef ecosystem, there tends to be a healthy mangrove system, which further absorbs any wave energy that comes through that isn't dissipated by our reefs, and also creates an overall safe and sturdy foundation for us as human beings to live upon. And in the bottom, that reef is degraded. And all those things that I just said are complete and total opposite. The structure is gone, so the life is gone, so the divers have now gone to Bonaire or the Philippines to go diving somewhere else and giving all those individuals money instead of us down here in Florida. That individual on the sailboat is probably getting seasick like I do because that wave energy is not getting broken down. That fishing net is significantly smaller. Those mangroves are gone, so there is nothing to help baffle that wave energy, and now that foundation has become cracked. So we can really see how much this is going to impact us and how much it currently is impacting us as humans. So when we restore a reef here at CRF, we are helping to mitigate and prevent all of those issues that we just talked about. First and foremost, we are helping to protect our coastline. We are providing habitat for marine life. We are bringing divers and snorkelers back down here through the tourism industry. We are helping people have food on their plates and providing food for individuals who want to go out and actually work in the fisheries industry. And over a significantly longer period of time, we are also helping to mitigate carbon dioxide levels. So that kind of brings us to us. We here at CRF are in fact the world's largest nonprofit marine conservation organization, dedicating to restoring coral reefs to a healthy state, not only down here in Florida, but also on a global scale. Our core mission is threefold, which is 1, to help restore our reefs, 2, to educate others on the importance of our coral reefs, and 3, to use science to further coral reef monitoring and research techniques. But we do believe that large-scale, massive action is required to save the world's coral reefs. What this means is it can't just be me and Jeremy doing something. It can't just be every staff member, intern, and volunteer that we have here doing something. It has to be every human being actively doing something to change their day-to-day activities to help give back to the reef. This can be huge, grandiose actions like coming down here and becoming an intern, or just becoming more conscious about the actions that you do on a day-to-day basis. And here comes the cool part where we actually show you how we really do this process. Our primary focus here at CRF is to grow and outplant staghorn and elkhorn coral, as well as 2 species of boulder coral. For those who aren't familiar, that top image is boulder coral, the middle is staghorn, and the bottom is elkhorn. And when looking at our aquaporage, which again is that staghorn and elkhorn, these 2 species are actually listed as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List, which means that they are 1 step away from being extinct in the wild. Now, I mentioned before that my favorite animal is an octopus. My second favorite animal, if you couldn't guess it, is Elkhorn Coral, because I'm a huge coral nerd, obviously. And the idea of going on a dive and never seeing Elkhorn Coral again scares me. But all in all, we do work with 11 different species in our nurseries. Now, the best way to kind of describe how we grow our corals is to apply it to all of us living our wonderful lives in quarantine. I am very guilty of the fact that in quarantine, I accumulated over 100 houseplants, and we basically grow our corals the same way that you would grow your houseplants, through a process that is known as propagation. When you have 1 plant and you want to make it 2, but you don't want to spend the money to go out and buy it, what do? You cut that node, so now you have two plants with 2 roots that are ready to be potted. Basically take that logic and do the exact same thing with our corals. Now, when we first started as a nonprofit organization, we obviously had to do something to get our corals from the wild. So we would actually go up and down Florida's coral reef to harvest these healthy wild colonies. But I'm really excited to say that our nurseries are now completely and totally self-sufficient. So we don't have to have any impact on those natural existing colonies. And one of the interesting things is that some of the genotypes that we currently have no longer exist in the water or in the wild, which means that we are quintessentially acting as a Noah's Ark for this genetic diversity. Here at CRF, we developed this structure that, for the lack of better words, is known as a coral tree. This structure is actually recognized as one of the best methods for growing large quantities of certain species of corals extremely fast. And on average, these corals can hold up to 60 corals at a given time. So what I want you to do is take a few seconds and look at this picture on the right. And I want you to pick your favorite coral. I'll take like 2 or 3 seconds. Everyone have their coral? Cool. We're gonna go ahead and jump ahead 9 months later. This is that exact same tree. Can any of you really find your coral? Some of them didn't really explode into that growth, but a lot of them did. Our observations indicate that the corals on our coral trees grow faster than they do when attached to the natural substrate. And this is due to the fact that we can control and manipulate a lot of different factors. As you can see in this image, this coral is tethered to the bottom. We can move that coral tree up and down in the water column based on the time of year. So we're keeping these corals in their ideal temperature threshold. These corals are getting 360 degrees of water movement. Our team goes out and cleans these trees routinely, so we're helping, the reduction of biofouling and algal overgrowth. And with them not being down on that substrate, they're not worrying about things like corallivorous snails and fireworms that are going to come through and try to eat them. But with this, it's not just this one tree. It's not just a dozen trees. It is actually an entire coral tree nursery, or again, a rainforest of coral trees underwater. In this image here, you can see our largest coral tree nursery, which is actually the largest coral tree nursery in the world. This is located in Tavernier down here in the Keys. Every single one of those small little dots that you see is a coral tree structure, which means that in Tavernier, we have over 500 of these structures. Tying it back, 60 corals, you do some simple math, and that means in this roughly 1.5 acre plot of underwater land, we have over 30,000 coral fragments that are ready to be returned to the wild. But with this is just one of our nurseries. We own and operate 7 different coral tree nurseries throughout the entire Florida reef tract. That's all the way up into Carysfort and all the way down into Key West, which means we have a lot of coral. Now, obviously, we just don't sit there and let that coral sit in our nursery forever. Once it gets to be large enough, we will bring that back to the reef. Back in 2018 and 2019, we focused on 8 different reef restoration sites. We had 4 in the upper Keys, 2 in the middle Keys, and 2 in the lower Keys. And like I mentioned, as we're swimming through our nursery and we see some of these corals that have undergone that explosion of growth, we recognize them as reef ready. Our team will go through with clippers and cut down those corals, making sure to leave some snow on the tree so it can grow again and repopulate itself. And then we use these super scientific milk crates that we then use to transport these corals to those sites. Once we get to this site, our team members go underwater with hammers and non-toxic marine epoxy, and we get to work. This is a process that is known as outplanting. Now, you probably are looking at this image and saying, hey, you're a reef restoration organization. Why is that diver hitting the reef with a hammer? That diver isn't hitting other corals. It's not hitting other life. It is just clearing the barren substrate of the reef itself. Because remember, roughly 97% of that Elkhorn and Staghorn coral is gone. So by clearing this algae and exposing that barren substrate, there is now a clean point of attachment for that epoxy to be put on, which means there is ways for the corals to actually be attached. We outplant these clusters in 7 to 10 corals at a time, which overall encourages the process of fusion, where when you come back a few months or even a year or so later, those corals will start to grow together and go from 7 to 10 to one single individual. And the best part of all of this is the fact that it does work, and we do have the data to prove it. That's pretty much what our science program is here for. Back in 2017, apologies, our data showed that after 1 year, our outplants had an average survivorship of roughly 77%. Now, granted, 77, that's like what, a C+, not the best, not the worst, but it's still passing. And again, this number is from 2017, and we do have some updated metrics. But again, those corals are surviving and they're still holding on. With all those different stressors that they're facing with, 77 really isn't that bad. We used to do traditional methods to go out and collect this, where we would have one of our divers like Jeremy go in the water with an underwater pen, pencil, and paper and go to every single coral on the reef and record a variety of metrics on them. And as you can imagine, that takes up a lot of time and a lot of hours. But we've actually recently switched to this really innovative technique that is known as photomosaics. With photomosaics, one of our team members will swim over the reef with 2 GoPros attached to a PVC pipe. These GoPros take a picture every millisecond. And what they do when they get all of these pictures, they stitch them all together, and it creates this really cool high resolution image or Google map of that reef site. You can see in this image, all of those individual blue dots are actually an individual coral cluster. And we are able to, again, zoom in and get high resolution imagery of these corals, which means instead of spending an hour or 2 underwater, our team is now spending an hour or 2 in front of a computer screen, tracing these corals and recording the overall metrics that they have. Pushing along further with this, back in 2016, we actually had a study that was published by a NOAA scientist. Her name is Margaret Miller. And she basically found that in areas where CRF restoration was taking place, the overall trajectory of staghorn coral populations increased, and in areas where we weren't outplanting, those trajectories decreased. Now you're probably all sitting here thinking, well, duh, that makes sense. If you're putting corals in one place, you're going to see more numbers. And if you're not putting corals in other places, you're not going to see those numbers. The more important thing that Margaret's study revealed was in the places that we were restoring those reefs, those ecosystems were starting to recover. We were seeing more fish life and other organisms back on the reef, and those corals were thriving and surviving. Speaking of that fusion, this is a healthy staghorn thicket. And the really cool thing with this image is this used to be 7 to 10 corals. I don't know about you, but I really can't tell where one coral was and the other one began. Keeping in mind, again, this used to be 7 to 10. They've all fused together and formed this beautiful thicket that us as a diver or a snorkeler would love to see underwater, as well as a bunch of other animals, because they're like, ooh, cool, somewhere to live. And more importantly, the majority of our outplants have been seen to spawn in as little as 2 years after being outplanted. Now, spawning is a really cool experience. If you ever get the chance to go on a spawning dive, I highly recommend it. It's like you're in a snow globe underwater. But with spawning, this is a really good way to indicate that our corals are thriving, because spawning itself is extremely energetically expensive. And when we look back at all of those stressors that our corals are undergoing, if they don't have the energy because they are so focused on dealing with those stressors, they are not going to spawn. They're not going to have the availability to do so. But we are routinely seeing these corals both in our nurseries as well as outplanting sites, spawning and kick-starting the reef's natural process of recovery. So you all remember Carrie's Fort earlier on in this presentation, those super fun pictures of that reef slowly dying. Here is an Elkhorn coral after 1 year of being outplanted back onto Carrie's Fort Reef. Now, admittedly, this coral is small, but it's better than nothing. It's there, it's growing, it's fusing. Those other corals are starting to grow and attach to one another. You can see that this coral is actually starting to accrete its own skeleton back onto the reef to create a more stable grounding system for itself. And to the left and the right of that one main coral, you can see other clusters that are starting to grow and fuse and do the exact same thing. And we are seeing this new growth amongst old mortality. These brand new Elkhorn corals are actually being outplanted on the ancestors that were once there before them, which means that we can see that ecosystem level recovery is in fact possible. And I'm really excited to say that since our origin, when we first were founded, we have actually returned over 130,000 corals back to Florida's coral reef. You can again see in the left Carrie's Fort back in 2017, which is some Elkhorn corals after being outplanted for roughly 9 months. And then jumping ahead to 2019, this is that exact same spot. And there is this explosion of growth underwater. Now, some of you may be sitting here and it's like, cool, this is really awesome. I really want to get involved and help this team restore our reefs. And we luckily have a wide array of opportunities to do so. First and foremost, we do have our recreational dive programs. These dive programs are one-day restoration adventures where individuals get a morning of education, and then they actually go out with our team in the afternoon on a larger charter boat. And we get to do stuff like nursery maintenance, and if weather allows, since we're not only infamous for hurricanes down here, but also for weather, teams will actually be able to go out and outplant corals themselves. If you're a snorkeler, you can also still join. You get to witness the overall restoration process firsthand from that bird's eye view. We have a citizen science program where we can actually have this app that's known as OK Coral. You will go through and take 3 different tests on things like whether it's Elkhorn or Staghorn coral, fused or not fused, and then bleached or not bleached. And then once you have passed those 3 tests, you can actually become a citizen scientist with us here at CRF. So when you are out on a recreational boat, or maybe you have your own boat and you see some outplants that we have done, you can actually record metrics for us. And then also, if you are a Southern Florida resident or able to stay in the Keys for 3 weeks or longer at a time, you can actually come and volunteer with us. We have both land-based volunteers and water-based volunteers where individuals, again, are working alongside our team. I do have to mention that unfortunately, due to the pandemic, the volunteer program is currently on hold, but we are still actively taking applications and hoping that we can see a light at the end of the tunnel sometime soon. And then there should be a fourth option on the slide, which is our internship. The interns themselves work even more so with our team than our volunteers do. And it is an amazing opportunity to get really involved and get your feet wet in the world of coral restoration. It's a really bad pun, I'm so sorry. You can also show your support. No donation to us and our organization is too big or too small, and 100% of the proceeds that we receive from donations goes directly back into our efforts for reef restoration. And you can also shop our CRF merch. These items are made from recycled ocean plastic. They are eco-friendly and they are great conversation starters because people will be like, what is that logo on your shirt? And you can say, well, do I have a story for you? Exactly. You can find more information on our gift shop online. And you can also keep in touch with us. If you are down here in the Keys, you can visit our Exploration Center, which kind of gives you a more further overview of our organization and all the work that we do. You can also sign up for Coral Chronicles, which is a weekly email list that gets sent out, which updates you on what our team is currently doing and what we've been doing the past few weeks. And you can also join us on social media. We do have our website, which has a multitude and wide array of information, but we also are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So thank you all so much for taking some time to dive into the world of coral restoration. And if any of you have any questions, we are more than happy to respond to them. And that's a lot what Jeremy has. And I think we have a few up in the chat box. Let's see.
We actually also got a few in Wova and our other platform.
Awesome.
So the first question we got is, what is the biggest obstacle you have faced when trying to save coral reefs?
I guess it just comes to the time of it. Not having enough time and not having enough people out there actually to do this work and make a difference. So I mean, just like, yeah, we have 21 interns and 10-ish staff members and stuff like that going out on the reef whenever we can to try and help these corals, but with COVID and stuff like that, it's not as many people, you know, so you gotta have all the dive program and all the volunteers coming out and helping the corals and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know if you have any.
And also from like my own personal process and thought process, one of the hardest obstacles in the field of coral restoration is just simply being able to educate individuals on what's happening to our reefs. With like corals, you don't see them firsthand. They're not like, you know, a forest or some other ecosystem that's terrestrial based. It's all underwater. And when people come down here and vacation in the Keys, they look out at that beautiful blue coastline and they're like, it's healthy, it's great. And people go diving and they don't know that that baseline has significantly shifted. So when you're underwater, you're like, this is a really cool, beautiful, healthy reef, but it's nowhere close to it. So I do think that education is a really large hurdle, because if you're not educating people and empowering them to take action, really that change can't be brought about.
Perfect. And then our next question was, because nursery grown coral are used to being in control sites, how well do they adapt to being in uncontrolled sites?
Yeah. Can you repeat that one more time?
Sorry, because nursery grown corals are used to being in controlled sites, how well do they adapt to being in uncontrolled sites?
You want me to get it? You got it.
So going off of what we just talked about a little bit, our survivorship from a few years ago is 77% roughly, and it's getting better every day out here. And we have a lot of data that shows that our work here from bringing our corals from our nurseries back out onto the reef and actually outplanting them is actually working and making a difference. So while it's not 100%, and we're still here actually working to do this. It's not done yet. The work's not done yet, but it is working.
And jumping off of that too, with those corals that are being grown in that in-water facility, they're basically being acclimated to the same parameters that they're going to be outplanted back onto to those corresponding reefs. For Tavernier, let's use that as an example. One of the sites that we outplant on is basically the exact same topography, depth, water flow, all of that, and it's maybe like a 5-minute boat ride from our nursery. So when moving that coral from the nursery back out onto the reef, it's pretty much already acclimated to the conditions that it's going to be re-outplanted into. But good question, thank you.
Another question is, how effective do you think that this program of restoration will be in the future?
I mean, hopefully very effective. Hopefully we won't need to have our work here anymore, but obviously that depends on a lot of different factors when it comes to not only the politics of global climate change and stuff like that, but just being able to effectively make a difference in the long term and have our restoration efforts continue to improve.
And another question we have is, has it been hard restoring coral with COVID?
So it was a very interesting time in COVID when the pandemic first became a much larger thing and was obviously affecting everyone on a global scale. Our internship was put on hold for a long period of time. The volunteer program has been on hold, unfortunately, since April of 2020. So it was hectic, to say the least. All of our staff were basically working on overdrive, but we were very lucky that we were able to remain an essential service since we are basically caring for organisms. We are nowhere close to like frontline workers who are working in, you know, all those other locations. But with that, we have actually been able to stay totally on track for our outplanting goals and other maintenance activities throughout the entire pandemic. So we were very fortunate and very lucky to not really fall behind on anything. Any other questions?
Yes. What inspired or made you want to get involved with coral reefs?
You go first.
Okay. So I'm 22. I've been diving since I was like 11 or 12, something like that. And I knew that coral reefs have given me so much joy in my life and stuff like that, getting to scuba dive and see all these amazing places around the world. And I knew I wanted to give back to this thing that has given me so much joy, so that not only future generations, like my kids and stuff like that, could see this stuff and care about it, but in the present too. So I knew I wanted to give back, and I found this opportunity with CRF, and I'm here giving back and doing what I can right now.
And then with me, I was really fortunate to actually do some coral restoration and monitoring work down in the Stressors Biosphere Reserve, which is on the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef. And then I actually came back to Florida to do further certifications with my scuba. And I went diving on our reef down here, and the reef in Mexico versus the reef here were completely and totally night and day. You went from beautiful corals to absolutely nothing. And that kind of made me realize that something's happening, people don't know about it, and I need to do whatever I can to help spread the word.
Perfect. The next question is, how badly do certain sunscreens worn in the ocean affect coral?
So that one's a little bit of a trickier question. They really haven't been able to further quantify the overall like rate or percentage of damage that is done by oxybenzone, avobenzone, or octinoxate. And they're currently working on like further studies to help create that statistic and that actual number. But what's more so known about it is with the free swimming planular larvae of corals themselves, when they interact with the chemicals that are in that sunscreen, it can sometimes cause the calcium carbonate skeleton of the larva itself to grow too fast, and it basically erupts out of the coral and quintessentially entombs it. So basically imagine like Jeremy's skeleton like rupturing out of his body and entombing him and suffocating him, for the lack of better words. So it really has a large impact on the planular larva, and without planular larva, you're not going to have new reefs that can start over a period of time. And there are some studies that are looking at the overall impact that those sunscreens do have on like long-standing reef systems, but I don't have those studies in front of me, so I unfortunately don't have like the direct response for that.
Another question is there any specific way to get involved even if we don't live near?
So that's actually a really good question. I'm going to throw that to Jeremy because there are a bunch of different ways that you can choose your change, even if you're not directly down here in the Keys.
Yeah, so going off the choose your change kind of aspect of it, there's a lot of different ways you can change your life on a daily basis. It's not even super difficult. You can go, when you go to the grocery store and stuff like that, you can use reusable bags, stuff like that. I personally, the biggest way that I choose my change is I've been a vegetarian for almost 13 years, so I don't eat any animal products or seafood or anything like that. So even just like a meat this Monday sort of thing, like a 1 day a week difference makes a big impact. So it's honestly really up to you to how you want to impact the world around you. Even if you're living somewhere far away, doesn't super matter as long as you make that impact and make that choice to help the coral reefs out there.
Any other questions?
How much work do you do on other global coral reefs outside of the US?
Yeah, so we have like sister organizations per se. Currently there is Coral Restoration Foundation down in Bon Air, and then there also was Coral Restoration Foundation Curacao, but they've actually since kind of outgrown the CRF name and are now kind of working independently. So a lot of it is us working to teach other nonprofits the CRF methodology and then giving them the tools and empowering them to learn those processes, and then they kind of go and grow on their own, which is really cool to see those individuals, you know, taking that initiative and actually giving back to reefs outside of the reef down here in Florida.
Perfect. And then another question we got is there a way that we could help physically after COVID?
Physically help after COVID?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the dive programs right now in the Keys are very fortunate to be able to still be running and operational, since that takes place on a much larger charter boat. We're obviously enforcing mask mandates and social distancing. So if you find yourself down here in the Keys and you're only down for like a day or two or a weekend trip, you can definitely look up on our website, which is coralrestoration.org. The different opportunities that we have with those. And then obviously post-pandemic, whenever that may be, knock on wood, hopefully sometime soon, you could definitely look into the volunteering opportunities. Again, those are our land volunteer and our water volunteer opportunities. With land volunteering, you have to be at least 16 years old, and then dive volunteering, you have to be at least 18, and there are some other associated logistics that go into it. And then you could also potentially become an intern, and I will let Jeremy talk a little bit about the internship.
Yeah, so for the internship, you kind of just have to apply online, and then it's more like a long-term sort of thing where it's 4 months for the first round of your internship, and then if you want to, you can stay longer for up to a year for a couple rounds and stuff like that, and really hone your skills when it comes to outplanting and restoration techniques and stuff like that, and help yourself grow and help the corals grow as well. And then also, do you want to talk about Coral Palooza at all?
Yeah, that's actually a really good segue. Good job, Jeremy. We also do have Coral Palooza, which is our largest outreach event that we do every single year. Basically, it's like a dive program, but amped up exponentially. As of right now, we don't really know what capacity Coral Palooza is going to be in, since it's normally a public large event, and obviously those don't really mix well with a pandemic. But last year for Coral Palooza, we shifted the entire thing into an online event where we could meet individuals from around the globe who are all working in restoration and share that technique and methodology with all who attend. Again, we're still not really sure what it's going to look like, but if you go on our website, there should be a set page or tab for Coral Palooza 2021 where you can find more information and sign up for email alerts. And then before the pandemic, back in 2019, when we were able to have it, we had over 600 divers who came down throughout the entire Keys, all the way up to Key Largo and down to Key West. And in one single day, those 600 individuals outplanted over 12,000 or 1,200, sorry, corals in a day. So it really is about that day of kind of embodying that large scale massive action that we believe in here. So fingers crossed that maybe we can do something in person, but again, more updates will come soon.
Is there a certain age you have to be to join the 3-week program that you guys used to offer?
Yeah, so if you are looking to do land volunteering and you're able to come down for 3 weeks or longer, it's just 16. And then if you're looking to do the dive volunteer position and you want to come down for 3 weeks or longer, it's 18. And internship, sorry, thank you, Jeremy. Internship is 21.
One last question. How do you pick the corals that you work with?
So that actually came from our like origin story, and basically what happened is they would just go up and down the reef trying to find different corals, and they would basically sequence them to get the different genotypes so we can obviously have as much genetic diversity as possible. And it kind of was like a haphazard process where they just would just go, cool, new coral, let's see if it's a different genotype, or if it's another genotype that we already have, let's continue to build and contribute to our stock. So it's not like we look at one coral and we're like, oh no, you don't look good, we're not going to take you. It's more so about finding those different variants of genotypes.
And then when it comes to outplanting and stuff like that, we have a large roster of all the different kinds of trees that we have in our nurseries and all the different genotypes on those trees. And we sort of pick and choose which ones have been growing really well and are big enough to be taken back out of the reef to be outplanted. So we kind of plan ahead, stuff like that.
Thank you.
Of course.
Our pleasure.
Any other questions?
I think that's it. Thank you so much. This was very informative.
Awesome. Well, thank
you for having us.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. If you have any further questions, you guys had some really good questions. We do have kind of an info account, which is just info@coralrestoration.org. You can also check out our website for more information on volunteering, internships, donations, or anything else in between. But seriously, thank you all so much for taking the time today to come and learn a little bit more with us here at CRF.
Thank you so much.
Have a good one, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the summit.